Okay, good evening, everyone. We'll get started only a few minutes after the starting time. Just to touch base with this week's Torah portion, we finish the Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus is completed with this week's Torah portion. You know, because this is a leap year, we have extra 4 weeks extra in the calendar, a whole month extra. And when you have a whole month, you're going to have usually 4 Shabbatot. Now, if the Torah was divided up so that we had a section read each Shabbat during the course of the year, even assuming you had no issues with a Yom Tov following on Shabbat, you would still find that you would have a problem in a leap year, because if, let's say, for argument's sake, 50 Shabbatot in the course of the year, and if you divide the Torah into 50 passages, portions, sidraot, when the leap year, when you have 4 extra weeks, you'll be lacking Torah readings. So some Torah readings are combined together in a non-leap year, and then when it's a leap year like this one, they're separated. Last week was the Parsha of Bahar, and this week is Bechukotai, thus completing the reading of Leviticus, Vayikra. But because, as it says, it's a leap year, they are separated. They're 2 different Torah portions. And so it begins with a very basic premise that especially is emphasized throughout Deuteronomy, that there is a relationship between our observance of the mitzvot, of the commandments, and what happens in this world. That if you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant you your rains in their season, so the earth shall yield its produce and the trees of the field their fruit. And it goes on in describing how nice it will be, and you have peace in the land, and God will look favorably upon us, etc. But then in verse 14, but if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, if you reject my laws and spurn my rules, and I in turn will do this to you, I will wreak misery upon you, consumption and fever, which cause the eyes to pine and body to languish, and all kinds of terrible things that are going to occur as a result of disobedience. And so we have, first of all, we're told that there is a responsibility that Israel has to obey the law, that there is reward for that, and there's punishment. We discussed some of those problems when we talked about the book of Job, and when we talked about the concepts of death and what happens after this life. And so we have this tension that always exists, this idea of obedience and reward, and then our disobedience and punishment. And then it concludes with some other various laws dealing with pledges that one make to God, and evaluations, which we're not going to go into. And then it ends, Ela mitzvot asher tzivah Adonai et Moshe b'nei Yisrael b'Har Sinai. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. So we conclude with the idea, because I was just reading an essay today about the various approaches to what does it mean that God gave the Torah at Sinai, and that's going to be very important because when we talk about Shavuot next week, what is the full meaning of that? Here, the way it concludes in Vayikra, it suggests that God gave all the commandments to Moses at Sinai. Okay? So we will discuss that later next week a little bit. All right. Tonight's subject is philosophy. Philosophy is originally very much connected with theology, but is also can be very problematic for theology. The love of learning, the love of knowledge is actually philosophy means love of knowledge. And we will see there are different philosophical schools that had influence over Judaism over the course of the ages. And what is important to recognize that philosophy is outside the realm of Jewish law and tradition, as it were. See, the philosopher is supposed to be not bound by religious ideals as much as bound by the way of seeing the world. I'm not sure I'm wording that the best way it could be, but we will see that philosophy sometimes challenges accepted religion. And thus, while it may be the handmaid of theology, at other times it is the opposite or the foe of traditional theology. Now, while one may find philosophical ideas, both in the Torah and in rabbinic writings, when we speak of philosophy, we're usually referring to systems that are created outside the parameter of the normal Jewish rabbinic literature. Right? We have the Talmud. There may be philosophical ideas found in the Talmud, but it is certainly not a philosophical tract. You'd have to go and search through it to find some of these philosophical ideas. And excuse me. So when we speak of philosophers, we're usually going to refer to their works, but these are not normally commentaries on books of the Bible or rabbinic texts, although they may find some that do that a little bit, but they are separate standing works in general. So we're going to begin with the first recognized Jewish philosopher, at least one that we know about, a man by the name of Philo of Alexandria. He dies around the year 50 of the Common Era. So he predates the editing of the Mishnah. And Alexandria in Egypt was a very cosmopolitan city. There were both Jews and Greeks and native Egyptians who lived there. And it was a center, though, of Greek culture in that part of the world. And it was also the site of numerous confrontations between Jews and Greeks, some of them actually violent. Now, when it comes to Philo, interestingly enough, there's debate as to whether or not he actually knew Hebrew. All of his writings are in Greek. He seems to have relied upon the Greek translation of the Bible for his quotations. And since he wrote in Greek and dealt with Greek, he was not known to most medieval Jewish philosophers. And his work is only mentioned in the 16th century. And in many ways, his impact was more on Christian ideas than really on Jewish ideas. One of the things that he sought to do, which we find is the story with many of the Jewish philosophers, is to reconcile the traditional Jewish beliefs, as example, belief in the Torah, with the culture which surrounded them, in this case, Greek culture, especially philosophy. So the way he approaches Jewish ideas are very much a reflection of his attempt to make it reasonable for those of the Greek world, whether they be Jew or Gentile. Those who saw philosophy as an important element in their lives, he tried to reconcile them with biblical accounts. And so one of the things that he does, which, by the way, we find in the Talmud as well, and many other Jewish commentaries, he says that the biblical depictions of God are not to be taken literally, but metaphorically. For example, God's anger. God cannot become angry. That which is perfect cannot have any defect, and anger would indicate a defect in the body of the individual what we're talking about. And so when God is described as being angry in the Torah, it means that the actions of the people do not live up to the divine desire. It's not, like, if somebody said something nasty to me and I got angry, right? It's not really anger, but it is really, you might say, a kind of disappointment. God's anger is Israel's failure to live up to what is asked of it. So it's not an emotion. It is a metaphorical description used to describe God's reaction when people don't live up to what he wants. We'll see this also much later on in a lot of interpretations, his as well, that all of the statements that are anthropomorphic, the hand of God. God does not have a hand. God is not physical. Indeed, the Greek philosophers in part had already abandoned the traditional polytheism of their day. And so they would frown upon a description of a God that makes the God merely a big person. And one could look at the Bible that way if when it talks about God. And indeed, we do find in some Jewish literature that there were attempts to describe God in very physical terms. So, but Philo is in keeping with a strong trend in Judaism to understand God as non-corporeal. And therefore, all of those descriptions, whether they be talking about emotions or physicality, must always be seen as metaphors. As the Rambam later on uses the language, if it says the hand of God, it doesn't mean that God has a hand. It means that if God had a hand, that would cause this to happen. When I lift up my phone, now, if I were really able to do telekinesis rather, I could make it come up into the air without me touching it. I wish I had, what a wonderful power to have, all right? Or problematic. Be that as it may, that's what God does. God doesn't use a physical hand to pick up something. God causes something, as it were, to rise, all right? And therefore, if God were a person, we'd say God lifted it up. It was the hand of God. Not that we should understand that God has a hand. I'll come back to that later on when I talk about Maimonides and one of the fights that he had with one of his contemporaries. Another important element in Philo, which really became an important element again in Christianity, was while he accepted the biblical stories, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as true, he also believed that there was more to them than what sits on the surface. He sees them as being allegories, teaching important lessons. As I said, this approach was very influential in Christian circles as they sought to interpret the Bible. In Christian circles, they went to the point of saying that even the commandments, many of them were metaphorical. Right? You shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, should not be taken literally to mean that we put on the leather straps of the tefillin. It just means you should have God in mind all the time, like your hand, just like your hand in front of you, you see it. Okay, so he opens the door to a lot of non-traditional interpretations of things to be found in the Bible. And all of that is a result of his attempt to make Jewish beliefs acceptable in the Greek world. He also wrote Defense of Jews. There was as I said, there were violence between Jews and Greeks, and he was responsible for some works that were meant to defend the Jewish community. Right, so we're going to jump up about 800 years, to the year 882 to be exact. So it's 832 years or so after the death of Philo, to a man by the name of Saadia Gaon. Saadia is his name. Gaon is actually the title. And originally, Gaon was the title of the head of the academy. There are a few academies in Baghdad, and the head of that academy, like today we might say the president of the university or the provost of the university, what have you, the chancellor. That was originally a descriptive term, not a descriptive term, a title. As time goes on, the word Gaon, which excellency, becomes a descriptive. You want to say somebody's a really expert in an area, he's a real Gaon. He's a real Gaon in that area, and thus you get, for example, the Vilna Gaon much later on in Poland. Okay. So now, what was also important, that unlike Philo, but like many of the important Jewish philosophers, he was very knowledgeable in rabbinic teachings. He was the head of the academy, where they studied the Talmud, and where the Talmud itself was in many ways finally edited. His most important work, it was called in Hebrew, Emunot v'Dayot, Beliefs and Opinions, which actually was written in Arabic. So also we see here something that we find often, a number of times, that the philosophers don't write their tracts in Hebrew. They write them in the vernacular. And in this case, Arabic was predominant. The Muslim conquest had already taken place. Saadia Gaon lives in an era which Islam is an important challenge to both the Jewish and Christian world. And also we find in Islam a lot of emphasis on rational thought, rationality. And indeed, most of the important Jewish philosophers were rationalists. And so as a rationalist, he sought to demonstrate that Judaism and the Torah were compatible with the canons of reason. So the philosopher believes, or at least a traditional rationalistic philosopher, believes that the human mind is capable of arriving at truth with a capital T through reasoning. That if you examine the world around you and you think about it and you use all of the rational skills that you have, eventually you can arrive at the truths that underlie the world. So now, that's fine in and of itself. Of course, different people come up with different explanations, so that doesn't always work, that they're in agreement. But then becomes a question, if the rational mind is capable of uncovering truth through its own efforts, why do you have to have revelation? Why does God need to reveal the Torah? If everyone is capable of figuring this all out, and the Torah is truth, and the Torah is compatible with rational truth, why do you need revelation? And so he argues, first of all, that since Judaism is true, of course he's starting off with that premise, so that makes it a little weaker, but he's starting off with the premise that Judaism is true, then those who fail to see that this is the case, well, they just haven't used their reasoning power sufficiently. They're in error. If I say 2 + 2 is 4, and you want to say, no, Rabbi, 2 plus 2 is 5, well, we know you're wrong. Right? So that's not really difficult for us to arrive at. And since I know 2 plus 2 equals 4, any other, and if it's were, let's say it was written in the Torah doesn't say 2 plus 2 equals 4, but let us say it was written in the Torah, and you insisted it was 5, well, you don't understand the Torah is correct, and you are obviously making a big mistake. Okay, but that doesn't really answer the question, why have revelation? So the way Saadia argues it, and again, this argument is found by others as well, since the human mind is capable of arriving at truth, it requires a long time of arduous work to arrive at this truth. You know, you don't wake up in the morning and say, I figured out the entire universe today. No, you have to think. I think cogito ergo sum, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. If I am, what is this and what is that? Is the world made up of ideas, and we just try and formulate them into concrete objects? You know, there's the ideal of a table, as Plato would have it. And we make different things that are the table. The table is a concept, irregardless of the particular piece of furniture that you make to look like a table. The table is a pre-existing idea. Well, all right, so now you're going to say, all right, if that's true of the table, then let's say maybe it's true of a tree. You know, we can talk about a tree, a particular tree, or we can talk about treeness. And trees are those plants that exhibit these qualities are trees, but they're not the ideal tree. The ideal tree is this idea that comes into existence in the concrete world. Right? So, you know, now you got to go deal with other things. All right, so what about virtue? What is the meaning of virtue? How do you arrive at the meaning of virtue? How do you arrive at the meaning of life, et cetera, et cetera? So if you do not have any external information, it would take a long time to reach the end of that journey. And not everyone is capable of doing that reasoning. The poor farmer schlepping in the field, planting his crops and just trying to make, you know, ends meet and all of that, he usually doesn't have a lot of time to sit around contemplating what the world is all about. So as an aid to that journey, for even those who can make the journey, and as an aid for those who cannot make that journey, revelation comes into play. You don't necessarily need to figure out all of the truths of the world. It'll be, if you're a good philosopher, you will. But in the meantime, you have a guidance of the Torah to tell you how to live your life and what the meaning of life is all about. Right? Now, okay, so we now have the basis for leading a good life, the Torah. But how do we know the Torah is true? Well, it was revealed by God. That's what you say. How do I know that the Torah is revealed by God? After all, you know, you don't say this out loud too much, but your Muslim neighbor says that God spoke to Muhammad, and his revelation is true. And then on the other hand, although there are not as many here in our neighborhood, there's these Christians, and they say their revelation is true. But how do we know ours is true? Because it was public. It was witnessed by millions of people at Har Sinai. 600,000 men, their wives, and their children were all gathered at the foot of Har Sinai. They saw the thunder and they heard the lightning. That's the language used. Right? They saw the thunder and heard the lightning. Okay? And therefore, you know, everybody saw it. How many witnesses do you need? Isn't 600,000 men and women and children on top of that enough witnesses to prove that God gave it to Moses at Sinai? So that's his defense, which reappears again also in other philosophers, for the veracity of the revelation at Sinai. Furthermore, human beings are blessed with free will. This is a very important idea found in almost all Jewish philosophers and found deeply embedded in Jewish tradition. As a matter of fact, when I started the evening off, I said, if you follow God's path, you go on his ways. If you say if, that must mean that the possibility exists of not. So if you don't follow God, it means you have choice. You have free will. Right? It's like the difference between a train, right? It's on the railroad tracks that can only go where the railroad tracks go or falls off, right? Versus an all-terrain vehicle, ATV. That goes all over the place. Okay? So human beings are ATVs. We can go whichever direction we want. And therefore, we can choose to live good lives or not live good lives. And therefore, there's a reason for reward and punishment. With the good being punished in this world for their sins, we came across this before, and the wicked are rewarded for their good things that they do in this world. And after the life, it's switched. The wicked have nothing but punishment, and the good have their reward. So Saadia really sets the stage for all the rationalist philosophers who are to follow after him. And I now want to turn to a few generations later, and we head west to 11th and 12th century Spain. And in Toledo, or Toledo, from which you prefer, was a man by the name of Yehuda Halevi. He was born 1085. He dies around 1141. We're not sure about his death. He was both a poet and a philosopher. And he too was known for a work. That work was called the Kuzari. Now, the Kuzari is based upon a historical event that we don't have complete understanding of the fullness of it. But over near Ukraine, in that part of the world, Russia, Ukraine, there was, in the 8th, 9th century, a kingdom of the Khazars. And the Khazars were under pressure from the Christians on one side and the Muslims on the other. And according to what we know historically, there was some kind of conversion to Judaism. We don't know how much really. It was just the king, was the kingdom, was the royalty, was it the nobility? But there was a group of people who converted to Judaism at that period of history. And so Yehuda Halevi takes this story that was spread around the Jewish world of this kingdom that became Jewish. And he tells how this came about. He creates this dialogue. It tells the story of the king of the Khazars, who first consults a philosopher. He turns to a philosopher to find out what's the best way of seeing the world. And he's very unhappy with his information, the way he presents it. So he then turns to both a Christian and a Muslim. After all, on the one hand, there's this very strong Muslim world, On the other hand, there's a very strong Christian world. And so one of those two should have the truth that he should follow. But lo and behold, when he questions representatives of Christianity, representatives of Islam, they all hearken back to the Hebrew Bible. So he says, well, if you are having to hearken back to that, why don't I go to a representative of that? And he summons a rabbi. And the rest of the Kuzari is a series of dialogues between the king of the Khazars and this anonymous rabbi. Right? So now, what happens in the? So the philosopher, and by the way, while I'm treating Yehuda Halevi in the world of philosophy, in many ways he was an anti-philosopher, as we'll see. Okay. One of the important elements in Greek philosophy, we find that in Aristotle especially, is, and this philosopher posits to the king of the Khazars, that there's an uncaring creator who is not concerned with the goings on of human beings, of humanity. The creator starts the ball rolling, gives rise to the universe, and he says, go have fun, goodbye, I'm done. And that doesn't satisfy what the king of the Khazar is looking for. And as I said, the Christian, Muslim all hearken back to the Torah and to the rest of the Bible. So the rabbi seeks to explain in conversation back and forth the king that God indeed, first of all, does care about humanity. God is not the philosopher king, the philosopher God. He's not the uncaring creator. God indeed cares about his children, human beings. He goes on to suggest, following Saadia, as I said a minute ago, that the proof of the revelation at Sinai is the fact that it was a public event. Because the king of Khazar says, wait a minute, the Christians say they've got their scriptures and the Muslims have their scriptures. Why should I believe yours? And he says, because both the Muslims and the Christians say it happened. They too agree with that. And there were those witnesses at Sinai who saw it. Now, what's also important, and this is why he is in some ways seen as the anti-philosopher, at least the anti-rationalist philosopher. Yehuda Halevi does not identify Judaism with rational truth, but claims it has a higher level of being the only truth. He says what the rationalist can come at, what the metaphysician, the philosopher can come up with, is not ultimate truth. Metaphysics cannot arrive at higher truth. For Halevi, philosophy attempts to know God, while religion seeks to lead a life in accord with God's will. The philosopher is trying to understand God. Judaism, religion, is trying to understand how we should lead our lives in accordance with the will of God. We can never know God, but the Torah gives us the will of God. And along these lines, the philosophers always talk about the rational faculty. We have the capacity, the ability to think rationally. Right? And Halevi recognizes that such a faculty exists, but he says there's a superior faculty. That superior faculty is the religious faculty. Now he tries to explain how we got to the way the world is today. And to be honest, there's a certain racism to it. We'll see in a moment. So now this, according to Yehuda Halevi, this faculty, this religious faculty, was inherent in the first human being, first man, Adam HaRishon. But it was only given to certain offspring. Not everybody got that genetic ability, that religious faculty, until it finally resides only amongst the Jews. And that's why a prophecy can only exist among Jews. Only a Jew is capable of having the religious faculty that will allow for prophecy to take place. And even amongst Jews, only some of them have that capacity. But now, the moral law, that's available to everyone. And this distinction between Israel and the non-Israelites will exist until the coming of the Messiah. Now, a very important element in Halevi's vision of the world is his love for the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. Is a famous poem in which he says, I am in the west, but my heart is in the east. And and well, I said, we don't know exactly for sure when he died. We know that around 1141, he decides to leave Spain and go to the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. We have information of his arrival in Egypt, and we have information that suggests he went on to go to the land of Israel, and then he disappears from the history books. Now, a common legend was that he made it to Jerusalem, and he was bowing down on the stones of Jerusalem in celebration of his arrival, and an Arab ran him over with his horse and killed him. Now, there's always been seen as something of a legendary explanation to what happened to him, although I remember recently I read an article in which there was an attempt based upon information that was available about such an incident, without identifying with Yehuda Halevi, having taken place in Jerusalem, and that very well may be the truth, that he made it to Jerusalem, but then was shortly after that killed in some kind of accident or an intent by this individual. All right, so now we're still in Spain, and Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, is born about 4 or 5 years before the death of Yehuda Halevi, 1135, and he dies in 1204. Constantly, I make reference to Maimonides, to the Rambam. Rambam, rabbi, that's the R, Resh, Mem, Moshe, Ben, son of, that's the bet, Mem, Maimon, that's we get my Rambam, or Maimonides, the son of Maimon. Now, we know him from his legal work, the Mishnah Torah, the corpus of legal decisions, the most important guide of Jewish law that was written prior to the Shulchan Aruch. But he was also very well known as being both a doctor and a philosopher. In the intellectual world of Maimonides in Muslim Spain of that period of time, the true intellectuals were educated highly in both basic Jewish texts and in philosophy and in the science of the age. So now Maimonides, towards the end of his life, wrote a work that's called Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim in Hebrew. But again, it was written not in Hebrew, but in Arabic. Yehuda Halevi's work was written in Arabic. Now, Maimonides was clearly an Aristotelian. The philosophy of Aristotle was very dominant in that time period. He was very much committed to Aristotelian tenets. And so he too, like Philo, who was more dealing with Plato and Neoplatonism, sought to reconcile the tenets of Aristotelianism with biblical religion. So just a little bit of background on Maimonides. He was born in Cordova, Spain, and he fled, his entire family fled after the Almohad conquest in 1148. In 1159, he and his family settled in Fez, which is in Morocco, and then in Fostat in 1165. Fostat is a suburb of Cairo. And so he writes the Guide for the Perplexed towards the end of the 12th century, even though much of it can be found in earlier chapters of the Mishnah Torah. So now, for Maimonides, God is clearly the God of the philosophers, that God, the kind of God to some extent that Yehuda Halevi was attacking. The definition of the divine for Maimonides is the unmoved mover kind of concept. Maimonides argues, and this is a very important element of his argumentation, once again, that that you start with understanding the language. Words are important. And so he begins his Moreh Nevuchim with lessons on the meaning of different words, different concepts that are found in the Bible, the Torah. What does it mean to be the Yetzer Elohim, in the form of God? What does it mean to talk about various ideas that are mentioned in the Torah? And he tries to define them. He also makes extensively argues that God is non-corporeal. For Maimonides, the corporeal is subject to all kinds of issues. Anything that is corporeal, body, is subject to divisibility. You can divide everything. You can break it down. Whether you start with a species, human beings, individual people, individual parts of a person's body, individual parts of what make up those parts of the body, down to the very molecules as we know it today, atoms and molecules, etc. So if God were physical, God would be subject to all of what the philosophers call the accidents of physicality. Furthermore, by being physical, God could not really be absolutely unique. God cannot be one. God cannot be unique. And that's an important element. Furthermore, one can never really say what God is. One can say only what God is not. This is called negation or negative attributes. If I were to say God is wise, that may limit what do I mean by wise. God is not unwise. God is not unaware of human beings. God is not finite. All right? So by making it in a negative way, it cannot be disproven from that position. And we don't limit by making a positive assertion. When you make a positive assertion, you limit that about which you're making that assertion. If I said Jeff Bezos is a millionaire, am I correct? Well, not really, because he's not a millionaire. He's a billionaire. He's a multi-billionaire. If I were to say he was a millionaire, I would now have limited him only to a few $1 million. So when you say something positive, you make a positive statement about something, you're by definition limiting that at which you make that positive statement of. But if I were to say Jeff Bezos is not without money, I'm correct. He's certainly not without money. All right? You can share some with me and I won't complain, I promise you. All right? All right. By the way, Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, when he talks about, I think we may have mentioned this, the non-corporealness of God, no physical body. He says any Jew that believes that God has a physical body is a heretic. And he was taken to task by one of his contemporaries, Rav Avraham ben David, who pointed out that earlier sages had believed that God had a physical body. And if you're looking at the straightforward wording of the Bible, it sounds like God has a physical body. So who are you, Maimonides, to say that they're heretics? Doesn't mean the Rav disagreed with the concept that God is non-corporeal, but he does not want to rule out other beliefs, saying that they are heretics because you, Maimonides, say it. By the way, in his introduction to Maimonides, his critique to Maimonides' work, the Rav says, before you came along, everybody would give arguments back and forth. What's the law about? What is, the two sides, this and that, and you would weigh in with your opinion. And then I could decide whether or not I agree with what you said based upon all the things that you brought forward. But you don't do that. All you want to do is give what the law is. None of the give and take, none of the difference of opinion. So how do I know I can rely on you? Maimonides would say, yeah, of course. You have to rely on me. That's what I want. But the Rav says, no, that's not the Jewish way. So similarly, he says, just because you insist that this is a basic value, a basic element of Jewish faith, that God is non-corporeal, you can't say those who believe in it, believe that God is corporeal, are heretics. You want to say they're wrong, but you can't say they're heretics. Now, one of the major issues that Maimonides had to deal with, and you have to understand, it's not so much that he's dealing with it for himself. This work was actually written as a series of letters to a student of his who was looking for guidance, how to deal with philosophy vis-a-vis Jewish tradition. And so this was really meant for those Jews who were struggling with philosophy and trying to remain loyal to Judaism as a guide for them. They were perplexed. How do we deal with these issues? That's what it was all about. So one of the major issues that Aristotle has, that Aristotle believed that the world was not created, but was infinite. Whatever creator existed found pre-existing matter and merely formed it, meaning the world is eternal. Jewish tradition, for the most part, accepted the concept of yesh me'ayin. In Latin, ex nihilo, God created the world out of nothing, something from nothing. So Maimonides has to deal with this very basic issue. Is the world eternal, according as Aristotle says, Or is the world finite, or at least created, as rabbinic tradition has always had it? Now, a sidebar on this is that if the world is infinite, it brings into question whether or not miracles are even possible. Because if the world is infinite, the laws of the world are such that God cannot interfere with them. So that's an important element of this debate. So Maimonides eventually tries to suggest that Aristotle made an error in logic when he wanted to say that the world was infinite. But interestingly enough, Maimonides argues that had he not been able to disprove Aristotle, he believed you could interpret the Bible to be in consonance with the Aristotelian ideal. Robert, you may want to mute your microphone there.
Whoop.
All right. Now, what's important here, and this is subject to debate, and it's not for us here, and if you want to go and learn about Maimonides, be my guest, is Maimonides on the up and up? Maimonides talks about philosophy. He talks about you don't tell everything. You just kind of give the basic ideas, and the student has to put it all together. He talks like a lightning bolt in the middle of the ocean, right? And it's all dark. There's no light, and then all of a sudden there's a crack of lightning and some illumination, and then it's gone again. And some want to say that Maimonides was being a little disingenuous in his argument, and that he really accepted Aristotle. But he knew that the masses of Jews would be incapable of accepting that. And therefore, he says one thing, but sometimes he means something else. For most of the Jewish world, at least up until the modern era, they pretty much accepted Maimonides at face value. But it's important to note that he was not studied in the Mora Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, was really not the subject matter that was found in the yeshiva. They would study his Mishnah Torah, although a lot of the times they skipped over the philosophical sections of the Mishnah Torah. Maimonides' vision of God leaves a lot to be desired for people who want a more personal feeling of God. One of the issues of Maimonides has to do with his prayer. How does an unmoving God, because God is perfect, God cannot be moved, how can he be affected by prayer? What is the purpose of prayer? What is the point of prayer? Does God watch over every creature, deciding the fate of every single individual? Does God only decide the fate of species? In other words, the mass, but not the individual? These are questions, and they're not easily answered. And Maimonides is not always coming up with an answer that really hits the heart. It may hit the mind, but it's not something that necessarily flows into the heart of people. One other thing that I want to point out is that Maimonides also stressed another Greek idea. It's not just found in Greeks, it's found in Jewish tradition as well, the golden mean. Almost everything in life has its extremes. Now, you can be miserly, stingy, On the other hand, you can be wasteful. You can throw away your money. Right? Neither one of those is good. Being very stingy, keeping everything for yourself, that doesn't help anybody else. It doesn't do any benefit to the world. But throwing your money around, buying drinks for everybody at the bar all the time, eventually you become impoverished. So what good is that going to do for you? But the middle between those two extremes, that's where you should be. Not a spendthrift, nor a miser. You should not be quick to anger. But no, on the other hand, you should not be someone who never gets upset about something. Sometimes you've got to. But if you're always angry, you're not going to be able to teach your kids. If you never get angry, never get upset with what they do, you're never going to be able to teach them either. Because whatever they do is okay. You shouldn't be too ascetic, but don't be a glutton. Find that middle path. The only place where he says that middle path is not the right one is when it comes to humility. He says you should seek to be as humble as possible. And that's one of the places where you go to an extreme. But otherwise, you should always try to find this golden mean between those extremes. But, I'm just touching upon a few of the important Jewish philosophers. Most of them I am not touching upon. We're going to move on now to the 18th century, to the man by the name of Moses Mendelssohn, another Moshe. Okay. Now, he was born in 1729 and died in 1786, the Age of Enlightenment, the beginning of the movements of liberal thought, and he was a product of that Enlightenment, and the beginnings of the movements of liberal thought and possibility of Jews leaving the ghetto. To begin with, you have to understand that when he goes to Berlin, when he moves to Berlin, he has to get permission to live in Berlin. Jews were still restricted. He couldn't just go to Berlin. Now, as it was the Age of Reason, it's not unexpected that Moses Mendelssohn was a proponent of the ideal of reason. And reason belonged to the world. So again, what does it, you go back to the same problem that Maimonides had and that Saadia Gaon had. If indeed reason is capable of arriving at the truth, then whatever the Torah has to offer is available to everyone, to all reasonable people. So what do you need the Torah for? What does it have to offer? So he suggests there's a difference between truths that are known to all humanity and revealed religion and law. Monotheism, morality, immortality of the soul, these are truths that are open to all. Judaism, on the other hand, is the revealed laws of the Torah, a specific way of living life in order to express oneself religiously. There are, to such an extent that some want to say that he did not believe Judaism had any dogmas. There was nothing like that in Judaism, according to Moses Mendelssohn. He was interested in general philosophy and the world around him. He interacted with his contemporary non-Jewish philosophers, had battles with some. He wanted to integrate Jews into modern European society, but he was not seeking to undermine Jewish practice. He translated the Bible into German to help Jews learn German. After all, they knew the Bible, so if they had their Hebrew Bible, they could learn what German. But the reality is that he very possibly opened the door to reform and the various other movements of the liberalization of Judaism, which why he is pretty much verboten in the Orthodox world. And he's often measured by the fact that his children all ended up converting to Christianity to get into the non-Jewish world. Felix Mendelssohn, the composer, was a grandchild of Moses Mendelssohn. So now let's go up another century, in skipping lots of very important people, to Martin Buber. Martin Buber was an Austrian Jewish philosopher, born in 1878 and died in 1965. Okay, so now we're reaching into the modern era. He was born in Vienna, and he studied philosophy at Vienna, Berlin, and Zurich. He was raised to a large measure by his grandfather. His grandfather was a scholar of Judaism. He was important editor of some of Jewish traditional texts. And when Martin Buber went to live with him, he found himself also amongst Hasidim, and he was very attracted to the Hasidic movement, not as a religious philosophy, not to live a religious life that way, but as a kind of overarching vision of life. He taught comparative religion in Frankfurt from 1923 to 1933. And that 1933 should stick in your mind because that's the coming of the Nazis to power. He directed Jewish adult education program until 1938, when he fled to Palestine to escape the Nazis. He became a professor of social philosophy in Jerusalem, where he wrote on social and ethical problems. Now, he's best known for his religious philosophy, expounded most famously in German, is called Ich und Du, I and Thou, 1923. Contrasting personal relationships of mutuality and reciprocity with utilitarian or objective relationships. He is not a rationalist. He is a existentialist. And his basic religious concept, human concept, was a philosophy of dialogue, which views the human existence in relations. And there are two fundamentally different ways of relating. One is the I, it, and the other is I. We use the term thou because English doesn't have the equivalent of the German, the more personal you. Okay? An I-it relationship is the normal way that we have of relating to things around us. I'm looking at a screen. That screen is a technological item. I don't have any personal relationship with it. I like it. It's a nice screen. It's big. But, you know, other than the fact that if it goes bad, I have to replace it, I'm not going to be torn if something should happen to it. I and thou is radically different. It's the way I relate to someone who is like me. It is a relationship that is not based upon my being able to use the other individual. It's not based upon any kind of objective utilitarian purpose. It's because I am an I and you are an I, and we relate to each other, I and thou. For you, it's I and thou. He famously begins his book by talking about relating to a tree. Now, you can relate to a tree as just a physical object that's there, or you can seek to relate to it in terms of its own being. Human beings can relate to other human beings in both ways. The ideal way is to relate to another human being as an I and thou. But we can slip from the I and thou to the I and it. When I go to the grocery store, and I check out, you can go to some stores now, right? You have your own checkout. You go to a machine, you do all the work yourself, you scan it, put it in your bag, in your cart, and you go on your way. All right. Or maybe you go to an individual person who runs it across the checkout line, and they check the price and they put it into the computer cashier and take your money or your credit card. Now, how are you relating to that person? Are you relating to that person the same way you related to the self-checkout machine? In which case, that's not an I-thou relationship, that's an I-it relationship. The person can just as well be the machine. So one of the things I try to do, I'm not always successful, but I try to do because I love this concept that Buber has, to make sure when I finish at the checkout line, I look to see the name of the person and I thank them by name. It's very nice and very helpful to have the names on the labels. All right? Especially me, I forget names all the time. But I think by making that, I no longer have that distance from that individual that I have from the checkout machine. Now, but we slip back and forth between I, thou, and I, it relationships with people around us. However, there is one relationship that the I and thou can never be severed, and that's God. Now, I may not be in touch with God, but God can never be an it. God is the eternal thou. And when I relate to God in this way, I can cross over the abyss, the distance between me and the divine. And so Buber tries to see in the Hasidic movement evidence of this kind of dialogical existence for human beings. And for him, any statement about God in a certain way is also a statement about human beings. For Buber, the biblical history of belief of Israel is a living tradition, a dialogical history between God and man, from calling Abraham out of his environment, the covenant at Mount Sinai, up to the prophets, is a dialogical history which demands anyone who joins it. So it's this dialogical relation of trust, not belief in dogmatic contents, that he views in Christian theology. He says, one can believe that God is and live in his back. He who trusts him lives in his face. Trust is proving trust in the fullness of life in spite of the experienced course of the world. Buber was not a traditionalist. He basically, his religious philosophy was, if the mitzvot speak to me, if the act speaks to me, then I observe it. If it doesn't speak to me, I don't have to observe it. Now, the final one I'm going to touch upon tonight is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was born in 1907 and died in 1973. He was the son of a long chain of Hasidic rabbis. Abraham Joshua Heschel, as a name, was a prominent Hasidic name. And he grew up in a world of profound spirituality, a world of faith. Though later on he went to the University of Berlin to pursue secular intellectual studies, he always continued to draw on the wellspring of his early religious experiences during his lifetime. He writes a beautiful, beautiful language, but it's not always easy to get through. He doesn't give us a straightforward presentation of religious philosophy supported by proofs and arguments. His writing is poetic. His books are descriptions of faith rather than argument for faith. And this style is deliberate. It reflects his understanding of language and religion. And indeed, for him, language and faith are closely related. Heschel doesn't present an argument for faith because he does not believe that the root of faith lies in the realm of rational argumentation. So again, we have a non-rationalist. He says, quote, "When the soul is not aflame, no light of speculation will illumine the darkness of indifference. No masterly logical demonstration of God's existence or any analysis of the intricacies of the traditional God concepts will succeed in dispersing that darkness. Proofs may aid in protecting, but not initiating certainty. Essentially, they are explications of what is already intuitively clear to us." Says you can't prove into faith. You can't argue into faith. You either have it or you don't. If you have it, then the rational philosophizing can help strengthen that, can help maintain it, but it cannot create it. He is something of a mystic. Faith comes before reason. Its roots are in our preconceptual perception of the world, which is awe and amazement. If you look out at the world and you see the beauty and the awe of God's creation, that comes first before the belief and the understanding. Persons of faith first experience God in the world and only then try to come to terms with this experience through reason. Modern men and women have closed themselves off to the preconceptual experiences by being too literally minded. By ignoring the poetry that is inherent in creation, they've closed themselves off to the possibility of faith. Now, Dr. Heschel was a professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary from 1945 until his death in 1972. And I had the experience of having heard him speak at the seminary synagogue. Now, what's also important about Heschel, he was a man whose religion had to be lived in every way. A fairly traditional man. I prayed 3 times a day, but he was also very active in the world around him. He marched with Martin Luther King at the protest march in Selma, Alabama. Some of you, if you look at some of the pictures, there's this guy with his white beard, bushy hair coming out of kind of roly-poly, and that was Professor Heschel. He described the march in these words: "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was both protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying." So he was involved with the civil rights movement. He put his body where his mouth was. He was interested in reaching out across the lines of the world between black and white, Jew and Gentile. His contribution to contemporary thought is well reflected in the titles of his theological works: Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, who is man? The Bible, Heschel helped for Heschel, the Bible really speaks from the divine perspective. It's from God's perspective. God, and it's not that God needs man, but man needs God. He was a scholar. He was a philosopher. He was a civil rights marcher. He was indeed a modern Renaissance man. All right, we just touched upon some of the major figures. And certainly, I hope you got some of that in. And we will, is there any questions, anything you have to ask about anything tonight? Now, I'm a product of my age. And so most of the philosophers, quote, modern philosophers are now already outdated or dead that I grew up with. And I'm not really familiar with some of the spokesmen now. But there's no one out there, I think, that has reached that kind of a status. I didn't talk about Rabbi Soloveitchik, Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, or Eliezer Berkovitz, who are very important in the Orthodox world. But these are some of the thinkers that are certainly going to be touched upon in any overview of Jewish philosophy. Okay, any questions? Okay, God willing, we'll meet next week and we'll talk about the holiday of Shavuot. I will not give you any recipes for cheesecake. That's up to you to go find your own. Although my wife makes a mean cheesecake. Then in that case, arrivederci, hasta luego, via con Dios. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.